On July 22, 1298, William Wallace stood in a forest near Falkirk in central Scotland and watched his army of 10,000 Scottish spearmen form four massive circular formations called shiltrons, knowing that in the next few hours his tactical gamble would either save Scottish independence or destroy it forever. Wallace was 33 years old, the guardian of Scotland, the victor of Stirling Bridge who had humiliated England just 10 months earlier, and now he faced the most dangerous opponent in Europe. King Edward I of England, called Longshanks and Hammer of the Scots, commanding an army of 15,000 including 3,000 heavy cavalry and 1,500 Welsh longbowmen. Wallace's strategy was simple and desperate. His shiltrons, circles of spearmen standing shoulder to shoulder, with 12-foot pikes pointed outward in every direction, would be impenetrable hedgehogs that English cavalry couldn't break. He had seen this formation stop cavalry charges before. What Wallace didn't account for was that Edward I, having learned from Stirling Bridge's disaster, would not charge cavalry into prepared infantry. Instead, Edward would use his Welsh longbowmen to systematically massacre Wallace's spearmen from range, shooting thousands of arrows into the packed shiltrons where men couldn't dodge and couldn't flee, turning defensive formations into killing pens. By the time the battle ended, 2,000 to 7,000 Scots would be dead. Wallace's reputation would be destroyed. His brief period as Scotland's military leader would be over, and the English longbow would be established as the dominant weapon of medieval warfare, a lesson that would be confirmed again at Crecy and Agincourt. But on this day, it was Scottish spearmen who learned that courage and formation discipline mean nothing when your enemy can kill you from 200 yards away and you have no answer. To understand why Falkirk was such a catastrophic reversal for Scotland, you must understand the impossible position William Wallace occupied in 1298. Just 10 months earlier, on September 11, 1297, Wallace had achieved the impossible at Stirling Bridge, where his 10,000 Scots had destroyed an English army of 15,000 by using terrain to negate English cavalry superiority. Wallace had waited until English forces crossed a narrow bridge, then attacked when only half had crossed, trapping them on the north bank and systematically slaughtering them, including the hated Hugh de Cressingham, whose body Wallace personally had skinned. That victory had electrified Scotland, driven English garrisons out of most of the country, and made Wallace a national hero. He was declared Guardian of Scotland, effectively the military dictator ruling in the name of the exiled King John Balliol. But Wallace's position was precarious. He was a commoner, not nobility, which meant Scottish lords resented taking orders from someone beneath their station. His authority came entirely from military success, meaning one defeat would destroy him politically. And worst of all, his victory at Stirling Bridge had personally humiliated King Edward I, who had been campaigning in France and returned to England furious, determined to crush Scotland permanently and execute Wallace personally. King Edward I was 59 years old in 1298, and one of medieval Europe's most effective military commanders. He had spent decades conquering Wales, building a network of massive stone castles to hold Welsh territory, and integrating Welsh longbowmen into English armies. These longbowmen were not the English yeomen who would later dominate at Crecy and Agincourt. They were Welsh professionals, men from South Wales who had learned archery fighting English conquest and were now employed by their conquerors. A Welsh longbow was made from yew wood, stood 6 feet tall, and required a draw strength of 80 to 100 pounds, far more powerful than the crossbows common in continental Europe. A trained longbowman could shoot 10 to 12 arrows per minute, accurately at ranges up to 250 yards. The arrows had bodkin points, narrow steel tips designed to penetrate chainmail and even pierce plate armor at close range. When massed longbowmen shot in volleys, they could darken the sky with arrows and shatter formations through sheer volume of fire. Edward understood that infantry armed with spears and pikes, no matter how brave, could not advance through arrow storms. He had used Welsh longbowmen in his Welsh campaigns and knew their potential. Now he would use them to destroy Wallace's shiltrons. In the spring and summer of 1298, Edward assembled the largest army he had ever led into Scotland. 15,000 men, including 3,000 heavy cavalry, 10,000 infantry, and crucially, 1,500 Welsh longbowmen. He marched north from England in July, moving through the Scottish lowlands, burning crops and villages to deny supplies to Wallace's forces. Edward's strategy was to force Wallace to fight a pitched battle. If Wallace retreated and used guerrilla warfare, Edward could occupy southern Scotland, but couldn't claim decisive victory. If Wallace stood and fought, Edward believed English cavalry and Welsh arrows would destroy the Scots. Wallace faced an impossible choice: fight and risk defeat, or retreat and watch Scotland be occupied again. He chose to fight, believing his shiltron formations could withstand English assault. He positioned his army near Falkirk in central Scotland, using a forest called Calendar Wood as cover, and waited for Edward's approach. When English scouts located the Scottish army on July 21st, Edward prepared for immediate battle. His army hadn't eaten properly in days, because Scottish scorched earth tactics had destroyed food supplies, and some English soldiers were near mutiny from hunger. But Edward knew that if he delayed, Wallace might escape. He ordered his army to march immediately despite exhaustion and hunger. The battlefield at Falkirk was open ground in front of Calendar Wood, gently sloping terrain that gave neither side obvious advantage. Wallace formed his 10,000 men into 4 shiltrons, massive circular formations of spearmen standing shoulder to shoulder with 12-foot pikes angled outward. Each shiltron contained approximately 2,000 to 2,500 men. These were not professional soldiers. They were Scottish commoners, farmers, townsmen, labourers, armed with long wooden spears and wearing little armour, maybe leather jacks or padded gambesons. Most had no helmets, no shields, just their spears and their courage. The shiltron was a defensive formation designed to stop cavalry. Horses will not charge into a wall of spikes. As long as the spearmen held formation and didn't break ranks, cavalry couldn't penetrate. Wallace also had a small force of cavalry, perhaps 500 mounted nobles and knights, positioned on the flanks. And he had a few hundred archers, Scottish bowmen with shorter, less powerful bows than the Welsh longbows, but still capable of harassing enemies. The shiltrons were positioned roughly 100 yards apart across the battlefield, creating 4 defensive strongpoints. Wallace's plan was simple: let English cavalry shatter themselves against the shiltrons, then counterattack with his own cavalry once the English were disordered. It was a plan that could work if Edward was stupid enough to charge cavalry directly at prepared spears. Edward I was not stupid. When his army arrived at Falkirk on the morning of July 22nd and saw Wallace's formations, Edward immediately recognized the tactical situation. The shiltrons were impenetrable to cavalry charges, but vulnerable to missile fire, because the men were packed tightly and couldn't disperse or take cover. Edward deployed his 1,500 Welsh longbowmen to the front, positioning them roughly 200 yards from the Scottish shiltrons, well within effective range. He held his 3,000 heavy cavalry in reserve, waiting for the archers to break the Scottish formations. The battle began not with a glorious cavalry charge, but with Welsh longbowmen methodically shooting volley after volley of arrows into the packed masses of Scottish spearmen. Contemporary chronicles describe the arrow storm as like hail, or so thick they darkened the sun. 1,500 longbowmen shooting 10 arrows per minute means 15,000 arrows per minute, 900,000 arrows per hour. These were not precision shots aimed at individuals. These were massed volleys shot in high arcs to descend on the shiltrons from above, where spearmen had no protection. The Scots couldn't dodge. The formation's strength, its tight packing, became a fatal weakness because men couldn't move without breaking formation, and if they broke formation, cavalry would charge immediately. The slaughter inside the shiltrons was systematic and horrific. Arrows fell continuously from the sky, striking randomly. A man standing in the front rank was as likely to be hit as a man in the center. Arrows punched through leather and padded armor easily at 200 yards. They struck heads, necks, shoulders, legs. Men fell screaming, creating gaps in the formation. Other men moved to fill gaps, stepping on wounded comrades trying to maintain the wall of spears. But the arrows never stopped. Minutes became half an hour became an hour. The shiltrons held formation, because breaking meant instant cavalry charge and certain death, but holding formation meant slow death by archery. Wallace, watching from behind his formations, had no answer. His Scottish archers tried to shoot back but were massively outranged by Welsh longbows, and achieved nothing. His cavalry tried to charge the English archers, but were intercepted by English cavalry and driven off or fled. Some Scottish nobles, seeing the battle was lost, abandoned the field entirely, riding away and leaving the commoners to die. Wallace couldn't order a general advance because shiltrons were defensive formations. If they tried to move forward in formation toward the archers, they would disintegrate into individual men who would be ridden down by English cavalry. He was trapped in a tactical situation with no solution except hope that English archers would run out of arrows. They didn't run out. The arrow storm continued for perhaps 2 to 3 hours. Contemporary sources don't give exact timing, but archaeological and military analysis suggests that to achieve the casualty figures described, the archery phase must have lasted at least 90 minutes to 2 hours. During that time, approximately half to 2/3 of the men in the shiltrons were killed or wounded by arrows. Imagine standing in a tight circle of 2,000 men, unable to move, unable to run, unable to fight back, while arrows rain down continuously. Every few seconds, an arrow hits someone near you. A man to your left falls with an arrow in his throat. A man behind you is struck in the face. You stand there holding your spear, waiting for your turn to be hit, knowing that if you break and run, English cavalry will kill you in seconds. This wasn't combat. This was execution. The shiltrons, which had been brilliant tactical innovations against cavalry, became death traps against massed archery. The formations held because Scottish discipline and courage was extraordinary, and because every man understood that breaking meant certain death, while staying meant possible survival. But as casualties mounted, the formations began to thin. Gaps appeared that couldn't be filled. The outer rings of spears became sparse. Edward I, watching the systematic destruction of Scottish infantry, finally ordered his cavalry to charge. 3,000 English heavy cavalry in plate armor on war horses thundered toward the weakened shiltrons. By this point, the Scottish formations had lost half their men to arrows and were badly damaged. The cavalry charge wasn't the glorious assault that English propaganda later depicted. It was a clean-up operation, hitting already broken formations. Some shiltrons held long enough for cavalry to recoil from the remaining pikes, but others collapsed immediately. Once cavalry penetrated the formations, the slaughter accelerated. Scottish spearmen in tight formation couldn't fight individual combat against mounted knights in armor. They were ridden down, trampled, cut down from behind. Men tried to flee toward Callendar Wood, hoping to escape into the forest, but English cavalry pursued, cutting down hundreds. The battle became a rout. Wallace himself barely escaped, fleeing with a small group of survivors into the forest. His brief period as Guardian of Scotland was over. Within months, he would resign his position and return to guerrilla warfare. He would eventually be captured in 1305 and executed in London by being hanged, drawn and quartered, becoming a martyr, but never again leading Scottish armies in the field. The casualty figures at Falkirk are disputed by chroniclers, with estimates ranging from 2,000 to 7,000 Scots killed. English casualties were minimal, perhaps 200 to 300, mostly cavalry who got too close to intact shiltrons. If we accept the middle estimate of 4,000 to 5,000 Scottish dead, this represents 40 to 50% of Wallace's army killed, a catastrophic loss. The battlefield was littered with bodies bristling with arrows. Contemporary descriptions mention that many corpses had 5 to 10 arrows in them, evidence of the continuous bombardment. English soldiers walked the battlefield after the fighting ended, finishing wounded Scots and collecting arrows from corpses to reuse. This practice, harvesting arrows from dead enemies, was standard because arrows were expensive and time-consuming to make. A single arrow required skilled craftsmanship, cutting and shaping the wooden shaft, forging the steel bodkin point, preparing feather fletching, binding everything together with twine and glue. Armies couldn't afford to waste arrows, so after battles, soldiers would spend hours pulling arrows from corpses and collecting them for reuse. At Falkirk, English forces likely recovered tens of thousands of arrows, blood-stained and torn from Scottish bodies, to be reused in future battles. The strategic consequences of Falkirk were immediate and long-lasting. Edward I re-established English control over southern Scotland, garrisoning castles and towns. Wallace's reputation was destroyed, and his political position collapsed. Scottish nobles who had reluctantly followed a commoner now openly criticised his leadership. Wallace resigned as guardian and was replaced by noble commanders. Scotland's resistance continued, but Falkirk had proven that Scottish infantry tactics couldn't defeat English combined arms of cavalry and longbows. The battle also established the English longbow as a war-winning weapon. Edward and his commanders recognized that massed archery could break any infantry formation, no matter how disciplined. This lesson would be refined over the next 50 years and applied devastatingly at Crécy in 1346 and Agincourt in 1415, where French cavalry and infantry would suffer the same fate as Wallace's shiltrons. Falkirk was the first major battle where longbow archery proved decisive, the beginning of a tactical revolution that would dominate European warfare for a century. The human cost of Falkirk extended far beyond battlefield casualties. 4,000 to 5,000 Scottish dead meant that entire communities lost their men. These were not professional soldiers. They were farmers who had been conscripted or volunteered, who left families and farms to fight for independence. Their deaths created immediate economic hardship for their families: widows with no support, children with no fathers, farms with no labourers. Scotland's population in 1298 was roughly 500,000 to 700,000, meaning Falkirk killed nearly 1% of the entire Scottish population in a single afternoon. Proportionally, this would be like a modern battle killing 3 million Americans. The impact on national consciousness was profound. Scottish resistance to English occupation continued for another 16 years, until Robert the Bruce finally won independence at Bannockburn in 1314. But Falkirk remained a trauma, a reminder that courage wasn't enough against superior technology and tactics. The battle also hardened attitudes on both sides. English forces treated Scots with increasing brutality after Falkirk, burning more villages, executing prisoners, implementing terror tactics designed to break Scottish will. Scottish forces responded with their own atrocities, raiding northern England and killing civilians. The wars of Scottish independence became progressively more vicious after Falkirk, a cycle of violence and counter-violence that lasted decades. The tactical lessons of Falkirk were studied by military commanders across Europe. The shiltron, which had seemed invincible at Stirling Bridge, was revealed to have a critical weakness. It was a defensive formation with no mobility and no answer to ranged weapons. Later commanders would try to solve this problem by giving pike formations their own range support, or by using terrain to limit exposure to archery. But the fundamental vulnerability remained. Infantry formations designed to stop cavalry were vulnerable to archery, while formations dispersed enough to minimize archery casualties couldn't stop cavalry charges. This created a rock-paper-scissors dynamic in medieval warfare, where combined arms, cavalry, infantry, and archers working together, defeated any single arm. Edward I understood this intuitively and applied it at Falkirk. His successors would refine the system, creating the English military dominance of the 100 Years' War, but the price of this tactical innovation was measured in Scottish corpses on the field at Falkirk, men who stood in formation and died by the thousands because their commander had no counter to massed archery. The mythology around Falkirk developed differently than other medieval battles. Stirling Bridge became a legendary victory, celebrated in Scottish national memory, and later dramatized in films like Braveheart. Falkirk, by contrast, was a defeat and thus less celebrated, though it was arguably more significant militarily because it demonstrated the limits of Scottish tactics and the power of English archery. Wallace himself became a martyr when executed in 1305, but his defeat at Falkirk was often downplayed in nationalist narratives. Modern historians recognize Falkirk as a turning point, where Scottish hopes for quick victory through infantry tactics were crushed, forcing a return to guerrilla warfare and political maneuvering that would eventually lead to Bannockburn. The battle also revealed the class tensions within Scottish resistance. Scottish cavalry, mostly nobles, largely fled or refused to engage at Falkirk, abandoning the common spearmen to die. This class division would continue to plague Scottish military efforts until Robert the Bruce unified noble and common resistance under his leadership. The archaeological evidence from Falkirk is limited because the battlefield has been heavily developed and most remains were not preserved. Unlike Towton, where a mass grave was discovered in the 1990s, Falkirk's dead were probably buried in multiple small graves or left on the field to decompose, as was common in medieval battles. Some contemporary accounts mention that bodies lay on the field for days because there were too many to bury quickly, and English forces were more concerned with consolidating control than with burial. The stench of rotting corpses would have been overwhelming. Medieval battlefields were horrific scenes after fighting ended. Thousands of bodies in various states of injury, wounded men crying for help, scavengers and local peasants stripping corpses of anything valuable, priests giving last rites to dying soldiers. At Falkirk, most of the dead would have been Scottish spearmen, their bodies bristling with arrows, their faces showing the terror of men who died unable to fight back. English casualties were minimal, and mostly treated with more care because they included nobles who could be properly buried or whose bodies could be returned to families. On July 22, 1298, 1,500 Welsh longbowmen demonstrated that the future of medieval warfare belonged to ranged weapons, not close combat. They systematically massacred Wallace's spear wall, shooting thousands of arrows into packed formations, where Scottish courage and discipline meant nothing against technological and tactical superiority. 4,000 to 5,000 Scots died in shiltrons that became killing pens, standing in formation and being shot to death because breaking formation meant instant cavalry charge and certain death. But staying meant slow death by arrows. William Wallace's brief moment as Scotland's military saviour ended in blood-soaked ground near Falkirk. His tactical innovation of the shiltron revealed as vulnerable to massed archery, his reputation destroyed, his political power collapsed. England learned that longbows could break any infantry, a lesson that would be confirmed repeatedly over the next century. Scotland learned that independence would not come through conventional battles, but through guerrilla warfare and political endurance. And 4,000 common Scottish men learned, in their final moments on that July afternoon, that sometimes courage is not enough, and that dying for your country in a defensive formation while arrows rain down from an enemy you can't reach is not glorious. It's just death.